Jonathan Moore. I am the director of the Institute of Politics, your host tonight here in the Kennedy School's Forum of Public Affairs. It is my great pleasure to welcome and shortly to introduce His Eminence Bernard Cardinal Law, Archbishop of Boston, who will speak with us tonight, as you know, on the Catholic Church and World Affairs, A New Visibility. Although he is well known to us, I want to take a few moments just to tick off some aspects of his background which you may find interesting, and also to make a few comments on some of the issues which he cares the most about and some of the activities which he's been most involved in before he came here to Boston and after arriving. The Cardinal was born November 4th, 1931 in Mexico. His father was an Air Force colonel, and his family lived in a succession of Latin American and Caribbean countries when he was a young man. And during this time, he learned to speak Spanish fluently. He graduated at Harvard in 1953 as a medieval history major. He studied for the priesthood at St. Joseph's Seminary in Louisiana and Pontifical College Josephinum in Ohio. He was ordained a priest in the Roman Catholic Church in 1961 and was consecrated a bishop in 1973. His first parish was in Vicksburg. He then moved to the diocese in Natchez, Jackson, Mississippi. From 1973 to 1984, he was bishop of the Diocese of Springfield, Cape Girardeau, Missouri, in the heart of the Bible Belt. He was named Archbishop of Boston on March 23, 1984, and Cardinal on April 24, 1985. And I just want to note here that the Archdiocese of Boston has over 2 million Catholics in 408 parishes, which covers 2,500 square miles. I want to, in finishing up this brief biographical sketch, I just want to add that the Cardinal has been a member of the Executive Committee of the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. A few quick notes on some of his special activities. In Mississippi and Missouri, Cardinal Law gained the reputation of a strong advocate for racial justice. Closer home to our home, that is, he has led a drive to help local lobster fishermen by contributing to the rebuilding of their docks and business operations. My grandfather was a lobsterman on the Cape, Cardinal. In the summer of 1984, he cooled racial tensions in Lawrence, Massachusetts, by going to Lawrence and conducting a mass in both English and Spanish. He has been praised for his efforts to build better ties with Protestants and Jews. Through his efforts, the stewardship appeal for the Boston Diocese has increased by $3 million in a single year. This money goes, among other things, to inner-city parishes and to schools which have heavy minority populations. Cardinal Law is credited with being influential in working out the problems and giving high priority to getting federal money, for instance, to ensure low-income housing at Columbia Point. And finally, I want to note that he was especially helpful, imaginative in getting the former governor of Mississippi, Bill Winter, to come to the Institute of Politics to be a fellow in the spring of 1985. Governor Winter and Cardinal Law were acquainted in Mississippi, and shortly after the Cardinal arrived in Boston, he was on the phone with us to say that he knew this remarkable man who would make a great fellow at the Institute of Politics, and therefore that kind of brokering, that kind of willingness to get right into some of the interesting activities and dedicated programs of his new home was demonstrated to the benefit of this institution very, very shortly after his arrival. And Bill Winter has become one of our favorite friends and most faithful contributors to the activities of the Institute of Politics. The Institute has become, in recent years, increasingly concerned about and interested in the whole question of religion and politics. And indeed, a short time ago, we held a conference here which I discussed when Cardinal Law and I first began to become acquainted over the telephone, which was called Religion and the Campaign for Public Office, during which conference we tried to examine some of the problems not involved in the traditional interpretation, the constitutional, the legal interpretation of the separation of church and state, but what happens when religious and political interests vie in the electoral process in this country. And we are increasingly interested here in the problems, tensions, and needs of religious and political interaction. Indeed, the Catholic Church has a new visibility in the world. Examples of this are Pope John Paul II's high-profile and high-intensity world travels, the whole debate surrounding liberation theology, the Philippines election, various activities in Central America, and the bishop's pastoral letter in this country, pastoral letters on nuclear arms control and the economy, and in other areas. So the topic that Cardinal Law has agreed to speak on tonight, the Catholic Church in World Affairs, a New Visibility, could not be more important, more palpable, and could not be of more interest to us here at the Institute of Politics and the Kennedy School. And it is my great pleasure to welcome His Eminence Bernard Cardinal Law, Archbishop of Boston.
Thank you. I got a little nervous there at the end because you started to give my talk. I hope you didn't listen too carefully. I need to make an initial apology, and many of you will perhaps sympathize with me. Whatever it is that's been going around, I'm getting over it. And which is good in a way, because if you ask a question that I don't want to answer, I can say I've just lost my voice. I'm conscious of the fact that over the weekend there was a play here which was based on the life of Dorothy Day. And I was reminded about the fact that when I was an undergraduate, the Harvard Catholic Club sponsored a lecture by Dorothy Day. I think it was at the old Emerson. That was usually where we held a lot of the lectures that we sponsored. The Crimson did not have a particularly favorable account of her talk the next day. And the report came to some of us who were, as I still am, devotees of Dorothy Day, that a government professor who will remain unnamed chose to use the Crimson account to really not treat her very well in his lecture. So with what might have been one of the first sit-ins, I don't know, some of us took a tape of Dorothy Day's lecture to Littauer and camped outside the professor's office, insisting that he listen to this tape of her lecture to see what she really had said. And it all fades into oblivion at that point, and I don't know whether he really did listen or whether we really sat him out or not. But it's nice to know that at long last, Dorothy Day has come into her own at Harvard in government and the study of politics. The new visibility to which my title refers is almost too obvious to require commentary, but it may be useful at the outset simply to document a phenomenon that is generally known but not specifically analyzed. Obviously, the Roman Catholic Church has been a presence and an influence in secular affairs for centuries. But that fact is not a sufficient description of the role the Church has played in the international system in the last 20 years. There has been a perceptible change in style and in substance. It is that change that I wish to reflect upon tonight. It is of some pertinence to note that one of the first places where this new style of Catholic presence and activity was analyzed was in a volume produced by the Harvard Center for International Affairs in 1970, entitled Transnational Relations and World Politics. In that collection, Professor Ivan Valier analyzed the Church as one of the key transnational actors in world affairs. It is possible to find the essay deficient in some aspects, but it does point toward the place of the Church in world affairs. In an increasingly interdependent world, where transnational communities and institutions take on a special significance, the Church is recognized as perhaps the oldest of transnational institutions in the system. The activity which creates new visibility extends across the globe, from Warsaw to Washington, from Manila to Managua, and from Soweto to San Salvador. In each of the places, the Catholic Church plays an active public role. It confronts or cooperates with governments of left and right. Its public role differs in accord with the characteristic of the political and cultural systems which it seeks to address. In spite of different concrete situations which have to be addressed, there are some key themes which link the public role of the Church as a transnational presence. First, the public role is always grounded in a pastoral presence. The foundation of the Church's activity is the moral authority it has, and this flows in part from its engagement pastorally with the people of a country. The highly public, dramatic role which the Philippine bishops played in the last month was solidly rooted in the way the Philippine Church has been living and suffering with farmers and peasants, students and professors, slum dwellers and merchants throughout the turmoil of the last 10 years in the Philippines. In the same way, the Church in Poland can stand with the workers of solidarity because it serves them in parishes every day. I look forward to a visit to Poland this August, and one of the things I'm anxious to see is Nowa Huta. The public role is fundamentally pastoral. Secondly, the public positions of the Church are based on some key themes which keep surfacing in quite different contexts. Political contexts. Preeminent among the themes are defense of human rights and the promotion of social justice. The Polish bishops have been the unique voice for the rights of workers in their support of solidarity, and the Brazilian bishops have defended the same right in supporting independent unions in their country. Cardinal Obando confronts the Sandinista government on human rights grounds, and Cardinal Fresno stands against the Pinochet regime on the same grounds. Third, while the Church has increased and intensified its public role, it has also set specific limits on how the Church should be present in secular affairs. There is no inclination here to return to another era of a direct role for the church in the political process. The U.S. Catholic bishops have tried to illustrate the proper limits by distinguishing between a church-state relationship in which we support fully the First Amendment and a wider role for the church in American society. The separation of church and state should not mean the separation of the church from society. And this implies the distinction being recognized between the state and society. There is both a legitimate public role for the church in any political system, and there are specific limits which should be observed by the church in its public activity. These three themes illustrate a transnational unity of style and substance which undergirds the role of the church in diverse political situations. But the analysis of what moves the church today as a transnational actor can be pushed to a more fundamental level. Precisely because the new visibility of the church is reported in terms of specific events, and the underlying themes of activity are often not addressed, I would like to lift up two aspects of the church's life which are essential to the public role it now plays. And the two are these: a unified moral vision and a complex institutional presence in the world. While the Valier essay was valuable in grasping the potential of the church as a transnational actor, it did not fully interpret these two characteristics of Catholic life. Before discussing these two aspects, however, I must state frankly that in the final analysis, the Church's involvement with the well-being of the human person comes from the fundamental doctrine of our faith, namely the mystery of the Incarnation. I say that recognizing that this may not have a specific place in this forum for discussion, but I think it does have a specific place in understanding me and the faith that I represent. I will then prescind from that as we get on to the other 2 points. But let me explain what I mean by the importance of this fundamental doctrine of our faith, namely the mystery of the Incarnation, as relating to this phenomenon. The eternal Son of the living God, God from God, in that faith, became one of us, et incarnatus est. Henceforth, for us, there is no other way to God than through the revelation in the humanity of Christ. Our deepest religious concerns, our quest for the contemplation and adoration of God's glory, all pass through, so to speak, the humanity of Christ. This is the basis for our humanism. The great Saint Irenaeus of Lyon said it succinctly: the glory of God is living man, and the life of man is the contemplation of God. That is why Pope John Paul II has said, in defining the direction of the Church at the dawn of the new millennium, that man is the way for the Church, since it is the way tried by Christ himself. In offering our humanism to the world, we are responding, therefore, not only to 2,000 years of experience, not only to the present experience gained from our presence around the globe, but we are responding to an imperative of our faith. We are seeking to worship our Lord by promoting the authentic well-being of the human race of which he is forever part, of the humanist state which he embraced totally, even to the point of death. In short, our anthropology is a consequence of our Christology. Since not all share our faith in the mystery of Christ, we offer the insights of our humanism by appealing to the capacity of human reason to perceive the wisdom, the logos, behind the reality explored by the human mind and experienced by the human heart. About this I shall speak in a moment. I was compelled now, and I'm sure you understand this, since you have invited me to speak to you as a Catholic bishop, to underline for you how our Catholic faith itself as faith is what prompts and allows us to seek to join with men and women of other faiths and of no faith to construct a civilization worthy of the human person. The moral vision. The fact that a few central themes keep surfacing in the Church's public witness is not an accident. In the temporal order of socio-political economic life, the Church is primarily a teacher. The principal contribution of the Catholic Church to public affairs is its role in forming the conscience of its members, in helping to shape the public understanding of the moral dimensions of secular issues, and in the specific judgments it makes on concrete cases where moral and political themes converge. It has been precisely this three-dimensional teaching task which the U.S. bishops have sought to fulfill in our two pastorals, the one on nuclear policy, which we concluded, and the one on the U.S. economy, which has now seen its second draft, a great improvement of the first, and hopefully yet capable of further perfection before it is promulgated. Next November, hopefully. The teaching role is exercised in very different cultures, but it is rooted in a unified moral tradition. The tradition reaches from the Sermon of the Mount to the sermons of John Paul II. It has been shaped by the minds of Augustine, Aquinas, Newman, and by the witness of St. Benedict, St. Francis, St. Clare, and St. Catherine of Siena. In the 20th century, and Dorothy Day, don't leave her out. In the 20th century, no area of Catholic doctrine has been so extensively and systematically developed as the moral teaching on social questions. The driving force in this process has been the teaching of the papacy, particularly from Pius XI through John Paul II. Part of the new visibility of Catholic presence in world affairs has been the product of this social teaching taking root within individual countries, often through the words and witness of bishops, but surely not confined to them. The statement of the Philippine Bishops' Conference, issued on February 14th of this year, at the height of the crisis generated by the election in the Philippines, is an excellent example of how the larger Catholic moral tradition can be used to address a specific local situation. The statement, which is clear and in unmistakable terms, challenged the legitimacy of the Marcos government, presupposed a whole moral tradition. The central moral judgment of the letter said, quote, "According to moral principles, a government that assumes or retains power through fraudulent means has no moral basis. For such an access to power is tantamount to a forcible seizure and cannot command the allegiance of the citizenry. The most we can say, then, about such a government is that it is a government in possession of power." End of quote. The paragraph is classic in structure and substance. It is a paradigm of the higher law tradition, sometimes called the natural law, or what Father John Courtney Murray of the Society of Jesus used to call the tradition of reason in public affairs. The essence of the moral vision is its ability to criticize what is in the light of what should be. The hallmark of the higher law tradition has been its ability to acknowledge that a government is in power, but to refuse to legitimate the unjust exercise of power. This is the tradition which holds that an unjust law does not bind. And it is the tradition which, in the words of the Philippine bishops, will say at crucial moments that a government, quote, "cannot command the allegiance of the citizenry," close quotes. Having made this basic moral judgment, the Philippine bishops then set some limits on the church's role. They counseled only nonviolent protest, and they invited the citizenry to consider the bishop's moral guidance and then to decide what should be done. Quote, "We ask every loyal member of the church, every community of the faithful, to form their judgment about the February 7th polls. And if in faith they see things as we the bishops do, we must come together and discern what appropriate actions to take that will be according to the mind of Christ." End quote. The same tradition which produced these guidelines from the Philippine bishops is the moral framework which stands behind three distinct public initiatives of the U.S. bishops. While our statements have been adapted to fit the contour of a democratic, pluralistic culture, the two similar characteristics to the Philippine statements are the style of moral argument and the sense of limits about the role of the church in the public arena. The three issues we have addressed are nuclear policy, equity in the economy, and abortion. My purpose is illustrative. I have not the time to set forth the substantive positions we have espoused on these issues. But all of our arguments flow from the natural law ethic. The phrase is often misunderstood and almost always controversial. But the categories which shape the natural law ethic are often used by many who find the tradition suspect. One of the reasons we continue to use the style and structure of a natural law ethic is that it provides us the opportunity to address both the church and the wider civil society. The pastoral letters on peace and economy are obviously the product of a faith community, but we have tried to argue the policy proposals on deterrence, arms control, employment policies, and programs for the poor in a style which will be persuasive to those who do not share the premises of our faith. Similarly, on the abortion question, our argument is that the taking of fetal life is a public policy concern for all citizens, not just a particular concern of one religious tradition. One of the elements which distinguishes the public task facing the U.S. bishops from the Philippines or any of the Latin American countries is the religiously pluralistic and secular character of our culture. Hence, we have tried to argue public issues in a genuinely public fashion. The most significant contribution of the pastoral letters, I believe, is that they have provided space in the public argument for explicit attention to the moral dimensions of complex policy issues. The letters have had a catalytic function, sparking interest in the moral dimensions of targeting policy and the moral stakes of macroeconomic policy. They have drawn others into the moral debate, some from this university, and that is one way for moral teaching to be carried out in a pluralistic society. It does not enhance the quality of the public moral argument to generate an attitude in society that the moral dimensions of public policy belong to the church and synagogue in an exclusive sense. The public debate should certainly not take place without us, but I am convinced that our best chance to find the narrow road which joins moral wisdom and political insight is by enlarging the arena of those who take explicit moral argument as part of their professional responsibility. This is a large topic which deserves an address in itself, but I must move on to a final dimension of my theme, the organizational or institutional structure of the church as a transnational actor. Excuse me. The capability of the church to function across national borders in an effective way is due in large measure to its institutional structure. The full complexity of this structure and its potential for transnational action still awaits adequate analysis. The dimensions you gave of the diocese. 2 million people, 408 parishes, divided into 17 regions, 17 vicariates divided into 4 regions, which means that you have an instant communication system, more or less effective depending upon where people are at various levels in that communication network. 50 million or however many we are in the United States, so many dioceses, each diocese so many parishes, and then you just project that out worldwide. The full complexity of this structure and its potential for transnational action still awaits adequate analysis. The Church exists daily on at least 3 levels of the international system. It has a transnational presence. It is a national institution in most countries of the world. I experienced that at the Synod in Rome the last week of November and the first week of December. And it is always a local community gathering people for prayer, education, and service in every corner of the globe. I am convinced that in spite of our new visibility in world affairs, we have not yet realized the potential of the Church to act at these 3 levels. We have a structure whose potential exceeds our strategy. And we can start with the Archdiocese of Boston. Precisely because U.S. policy so decisively affects so many areas of the world, the U.S. bishops feel the challenge of the transnational potential of the Church. In the last 2 years, we, as a Conference of Bishops, have sent delegations of bishops to confer with the local church in Central America, South Africa, Ireland, and Cuba. The last trip was one which I personally made with others. In each case, the expectation was that we would return to the United States to address aspects of U.S. policy, a task which we are continually trying to fulfill, as well, obviously, is to strengthen, and primarily to strengthen, the pastoral relationships between the Church in those nations and the Church in our own nation. This pattern of consultation, expression of solidarity between local churches, and then public action in this country on policy issues like Central America and South Africa will undoubtedly continue. It is a major way in which the transnational presence of the Church can be effectively utilized. The preeminent way in which the Catholic Church addresses the international system, of course, is through the activity of the Holy See, and especially today through the Pope. John Paul II has brought the international visibility and influence of the See of Peter to a qualitatively new level of engagement. Analysts of very different political persuasion have singled out his unique impact in the international arena. By word and deed, he seeks to place the Church in the service of a more just and peaceful world. His personal activity is what most fascinates observers, but I would stress his leadership for other levels of the Church, like bishops' conferences. And I would add that the events recently in Haiti and the events recently in the Philippines will invite study down the pike as to what impact the Pope's earlier visits had in his meeting with the bishops of those lands to what subsequently transpired. Certainly his social teaching has provided the structural core of our pastoral letters in the United States. In addition, the importance he gives the social ministry as a dimension of the total ministry of the Church has led the way for the activity of his brother bishops throughout the world. A special concern of the Holy Father, and I would conclude by focusing briefly on two specific gnawing questions in the international scene, where I think the Church as a transnational actor can do and hopefully will do more. A special concern of the Holy Father is for the problem of the crushing indebtedness that now burdens third world countries. This was urgently expressed in his address to the United Nations, delivered for him by the Secretary of State, Cardinal Agostino Casaroli, on October 18th of last year in New York. This global indebtedness of the third world, he said, and the new relationships of dependence which it creates, cannot be posed solely in economic and monetary terms. It has to become more widely a problem of political cooperation and economic ethics. The Pope continued, quote, "The economic, social, and human cost of this situation is often such as to bring whole countries to the brink of breakdown. Moreover, neither the creditor countries nor the debtor countries have anything to gain from the development of situations of despair that would be uncontrollable. Justice and the interest of all demand that at the world level the situation should be envisaged in all its aspects and dimensions, not just the economic and monetary aspects and dimensions, but the social, political, and human ones too." In composing our own pastoral, which we are doing now, on the U.S. economy, the Catholic bishops of the United States are paying close attention to the Holy Father's concern on this theme. Another matter of profound concern to the Pope, which U.S. bishops especially share because it so closely affects our own country's responsibilities, is the prolonged suffering of the people of Lebanon. The Holy See has since early in this century seen Lebanon, with its mixed population of Christians and Muslims, as presenting an outstanding opportunity for positive communication between these two great faith communities, and has looked to the Catholics of Lebanon, Maronite, Melkite, and others, to promote that dialogue. The Holy Father has often called attention to the present plight of Lebanon, and I would hope would inspire a greater interest on the part of the whole Church and critical actors on the world scene. The Christians of that country often feel very isolated, and in recent years particularly have once again believed they are under immediate threat to their lives and the freedom of their communities. They are not alone in their suffering, as the other communities of Lebanon have also undergone trials that drive them frequently to despairing acts. The priorities for which the Lebanese people need every help we in the United States can give them are for the relieving of the external pressures by which all the issues of regional conflict in the countries around them are fought out on Lebanese soil and with Lebanese proxies. This calls for far greater attention and urgency than the U.S. has been giving to the Middle Eastern crisis for some time. It is also most necessary that trust be built between the Christian and Muslim communities of Lebanon itself, that mutual respect and understanding grow among them, and the paranoid reactions that constantly poison the atmosphere of intercommunal relations in Lebanon be overcome. If the Christian communities of Lebanon are to play their necessary part in this work of reconciliation, they must know that their Christian brethren in other countries, and especially in the United States, stand by them, are properly informed and concerned and prepared to offer them genuine help. The Church as a transnational actor should be able to play a significant role in this. Such help is not simply to rescue the Lebanese Christians from recurrent crises that are sometimes of their own making, but precisely for the work of reconciliation and deepened understanding with the Muslim communities about them. Papal leadership has been essential to the new visibility of the Catholic Church in world affairs. But as we have seen in the Philippines in the past days, it is the church as a whole, laity, clergy, religious, and bishops, who have been moved by the moral vision of the gospel. I cannot predict exactly how the new visibility of the church will influence the world or even the church itself. But I am confident that a process of social engagement has begun which will not subside. It will characterize the church's life in the rest of this century, and it will move us into the next millennium. Thank you for your attention.
His Eminence has agreed to take questions. Often we have microphones on the floor, which are not here tonight. So people who are upstairs in the second deck are welcome, invited to use those microphones. And people here on the first floor, if you could please rise and speak clearly when you address your question, I think we'll get along just fine. And I would suggest, if you're willing, Cardinal Law, for you to field the questions yourself.
Be happy to, yes. I don't. Oh, excuse me. The question was the view that how do I? Yeah.
Well, assuming that you see the value in hierarchical leadership in the church, how do you deal with the question of the power of
How do I view? Since I view hierarchical leadership as critical, important, and having a place in the life of the church, how do I reconcile that with the exclusion of women from hierarchical? Well, the question of the ordination of women to the priesthood is, I think, quite distinct from the issue that I'm here discussing. As I concluded, and I would hope was implicit throughout the talk, that bishops, which would be the hierarchy, which would be a very, very small percentage of the 800 million people who constitute the church, do not exclusively express that church engagement. And so, I think that the question you raise is quite a distinct question, and I hardly think this is the place to discuss it. Yes?
There's been a lot in the news about countries like the Philippines and Haiti, but what hasn't been too much in the news in the United States is the government of Alan Garcia in Peru. And I believe Alan Garcia has met several times since he's come into office with Pope John Paul. And what's really at issue, as far as I see, as far as what you said about the international debt, is that Garcia, rather than being sort of just asking for help, has said that what the Latin American countries must do is unite. He's saying that he will only pay 10% of his export income to the IMF, and particularly targets the IMF as causing the breakdown of the conditions for development of undeveloped countries. Do you see any role the church can play in bringing about a new economic order like he was talking about?
You would have perhaps more specific information and later information than I have. I was under the impression that he has somehow backed off of his initial statement, but that doesn't in any way vitiate the general thrust of your comment. I do think that what the Holy Father is suggesting is that we need a new kind of a forum to discuss this question of third world debt in dimensions that it has not hitherto been discussed. And I don't know that would lead to a new economic order that Garcia would be advocating, but I think certainly his point of view would need to be a part of that forum. And I think, the government there is a government which presents a considerable amount of hope for Peru.
In terms of
Where is this?
up here,
Okay, thank you.
in terms of the policy of mercy, of the moral policy of mercy of the Roman Catholic Church, I'm an Anglican by faith. I believe in all the Catholic creeds, all of them. I remain an Anglican only because it is the faith of my ancestors, and it is the faith of my cultural conditioning, and I prefer to remain within that church. Whenever I enter a Roman Catholic church, if I act with integrity, I may not receive Holy Communion. I feel that something very important is being denied me, and I wonder how you feel in terms of the policy of mercy of the Roman Catholic Church.
Well, I feel the pain that you feel, but our understanding of the Eucharist is implicit in the Eucharistic prayer as we have it whenever the Eucharist is celebrated. Would see the Eucharist as both the sign of the unity of the Church as well as the means for that unity to be intensified. And minimal, as the Church understands it, for that sign to have integrity is an acceptance, among other things, of the unique role of the Bishop of Rome as the chief shepherd of the Church with immediate and direct jurisdiction. And in extraordinary circumstances, yes. Yes.
I was really impressed by the introduction of the strong advocate for racial justice. And being with you, I really appreciate the work that you've done bringing Catholic community together in this doctrine, and also with the work of the court. Except there's 10 to 15% of the population which is essentially excluded from the Catholic Church and the community. I was impressed when you had your professor listen to the case of Dorothy Day. But you yourself were not immediately with the Gay Lesbian community, particularly the Gay Lesbian Catholic organization. You tried to contact them many times, but did not meet with them. You neglected to talk about another pastoral letter which was sent out advising persons to vote against the Gay and Lesbian Civil Rights Bill. You're also talking about when the Pope went to certain countries, fermented a lot of popular support in Boston, with more attacks on lesbians to the men because of the homophobic policies of the church. My question is, why can the church cannot see the parallels between racism, anti-Semitism, and homophobia?
Because it sees that they are not the same thing. You want to go into that here? It would be, we would, in a very short way, and you, I'm sure you know what answer I will give, and you're raising the question doesn't change my view. It would be based on the very kind of an ethical analysis that I have illustrated, that given our understanding of the human person, the human nature, this is not seen as flowing out of that nature, and is not seen as constructive of the common good. Certainly, the acts of violence to which you would be contrary to any moral conscience. But to deplore that is one thing. To accept as totally acceptable a gay lifestyle as a legitimate moral option for everyone else is something quite different. And the traditional moral analysis out of which we operate simply does not lead us to the possibility of saying that the common good is best served by indicating that in this area these things really don't make and shouldn't make any difference and don't impact the common good at all. We think they do, and we believe that.
Why was Leonardo Boff silenced? You're talking about liberation theology and wondering about Leonardo Boff, whether the silencing came because of his politics or because of his view of the church, and whether or not you agree with that.
I'm not an the question is on Leonardo Boff, who is a Franciscan theologian in Brazil. My understanding is that the problem in his writings were more in relation to his ecclesiology. And I would have confidence with the judgment that was reached on the basis of those who made the judgment. With regard to liberation theology, as you know, there is a document that has been issued by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and supposedly a second one will be coming, not as I understand it to contradict the first one, but to develop the first one. And what is sometimes misunderstood is that actions like that document or the action against Leonardo Boff would indicate that somehow the kind of thing that I've been indicating in the Philippines and elsewhere is in one direction, whereas the action against Boff's writing and the statement on liberation theology is in another direction. I think one can obviously disagree with a judgment reached on a book or a body of writings or an analysis of a movement, but I think it would be incorrect to read the statements on liberation theology as in any way backing off from the thrust of what I have indicated here. As a matter of fact, that document, which takes a critical stance, from a liberation theology which would use a Marxist critical analysis, while it's negative on that score, in terms of its comment about social and economic injustices around the world, it's very devastating. It's as strong as any indictment that has come out in a church document. So that the difficulty, as you rightly perceive, lies more in ecclesiological terms and less in addressing social and economic ills. Yes?
You described to us how the Catholic Church was frequently couching its argument these days, especially the American Orthodox bishops, in secular or human natural rights terms, so as to be persuasive in a society that you yourself describe as a secular society. I'm wondering if you perceive any danger by doing this repeatedly and by attracting attention to its argument in these terms. The Catholic Church in America is likely to present a danger to itself of coming across to the nation as a secular institution and as a secular voice itself, worthy only of the respect its views might gain on their own space of power, like the Democratic Party or the Chamber of Commerce, and whether it might lose its capacity to represent itself as what it feels itself to be, namely the mystical body of Christ.
Well, I don't lose sleep over that question, but I think it's a real question, But on the other hand, how do we engage in the public debate with regard to the moral dimensions of an issue if our engagement in that moral debate in a society where Catholic premises would not be generally accepted, if that argument is based, say, on papal encyclicals, you've got to believe this because Pope Pius XII said it, you wouldn't get very far, and you would be rightly you would be rightly accused of failing to understand the fabric of a pluralistic society. So I don't think that I think that in, is it Parsons' terms of the sect and the church, the sociological terms, if you want to function solely as a sect, then you would stake out your position and you would express it in terms that are specific to yourself, and then and just let it be that way. And if it's convincing, fine, and if it's not, fine. But if you take the church model, which he's speaking sociologically and not theologically, if you take the church model, you rather see how you can engage in the dialogue, in the wider dialogue. And I think that's the only way that you can. That's why I injected that passage about how I would see this from the perspective of faith. But I would not expect, I wouldn't argue from that point of view in a public forum if I were trying to be persuasive specifically on an issue of the formulation of public policy. Quite something else if I were trying to win somebody to Christ, which I'm also interested in doing. Okay? But it's a problem. Yes, sir. Yes.
Next, after this gentleman, we've got a couple of people who can stand up.
Oh, in the top. I'm sorry.
My question is...
Then I'll come back.
Okay. I wonder if you would comment a little about the relationship between private personal commitments and public responsibilities. Because it's not uncommon to hear public officials say, I personally believe X, Y, and Z, but my role as administrator or my role as elected official calls me to do other kinds of things.
That's a question which could lead me into an area that I wouldn't want to go at this hour of the night. But I think that a person should act, if a person has worked out the ethical dimensions of a problem honestly and consistently, then that person, it seems to me, ought to attempt to, and if they are capable of being persuasive on terms that should be applicable to anyone, not simply positions that are worked out of a confessional stance, then I don't think that there should be a distinction. I think the person, the official, ought to work out of that private conviction. If not, how does that person really have integrity? Now, there is a degree to which, in our country, the way we come to decisions is by a certain measure of compromise. But there is a point beyond which an individual can compromise. And I would hope it's at that point that the integrity of the public official would demand that either I stand by my conscience or I get out.
So I guess the real question is, then, where do you draw the line between confessional commitments and more universal kinds of claims? The abortion issue is sort of the most striking example.
Well, abortion issue is, I would maintain very strongly that a pro-life position is arguable on the basis of an appeal which is lodged in our constitutional tradition, in the kind of general moral consciousness that is sometimes referred to and sometimes dismissed as natural law. I do not think that in that issue one has to resort to a confessional articulation in order to come to the judgment that human life should be protected by law. And obviously that's a debatable point. But I don't think that a person whose confessional stance also and consistently has maintained the sanctity of life, I don't think such a person is off the hook by hiding under the banner of confessional teaching and saying, well, I can't impose my belief on somebody else. Because the point is, belief though it may be, it is more than that. It ought to be a reasoned position. Yes?
Great respect for the church's ability as a institution to work toward peace in many areas that you cited. And the church has worked very effectively with countries which have serious territorial disputes and have made questionable claims. And I was wondering whether it might be useful for the church to recognize the state of Israel, which has a very which is in a very difficult position and which is also in the midst of very complicated negotiations to find peace, and whether that would be especially important as a sign of reconciliation and respect for those of us of the Jewish faith
Right.
for whom Israel has such special place.
Well, certainly. Did you all hear the question? The question is, recognizing what the church has done as a transnational actor, do I not think that the recognition of the state of Israel by the Holy See might be an appropriate action in that line, particularly given the vexing situation of a search for peace in the Middle East? I think it's necessary to say that the question of recognizing Israel as a state by the Holy See, recognizing